You ever feel that way? Please don't ask me how I've been. Don't make me pretend, because I'm going to have to be fake happy. You're already probably fake happy, and you've ever been in those moments where it's like, I just don't want to talk about how I'm really doing, how I'm really feeling deep down inside. And maybe it's because, in that moment, your kids are on your last nerve. Or maybe it's because in the course of events, that client is just piling on with everything that they expect, and it doesn't seem like there's any way to make them happy. Maybe for you, it's that your to-do list at the end of the day is somehow larger than the to-do list that you started the day with, in spite of the fact that you've been busy all day long. For others of us, it's because we've got that professor who thinks they're the only teacher that we have, the only class that we're taking during that semester, and it just piles on and piles on and piles on. For others of us, in spite of our best efforts, we've followed all the advice and all the restrictions, and yet the doctor's sitting across from us still saying that things aren't working, they're not looking any better. And then for others of us, we've tried to handle things as maturely as we possibly could, and yet there is still incredible tension in that family relationship. And if we're honest, we find ourselves hanging on by a thread. That's how we feel. We've done everything we can, and we are hanging on. So for you, maybe you're feeling this right now, and this is just a whole lot too real to what's happening in your life right this second. Or maybe you're doing okay, but this is where you were a week ago or a month ago, and you're looking back and you're like, oh yeah, I know exactly how that feels. But maybe today you're fine, and this is simply your warning. It's coming. This week, this month, this year, you're going to feel this feeling of, I am hanging on by a thread. And this is not a new feeling. This is a feeling that's been around for millennia. And this morning, as we dive into a narrative, it's a narrative that was laid out way back in the Jewish scriptures. And it was combined with the documentation of Jesus' life, and then the letters that were written to the early church, and it was all put together in what we refer to as our Bible, made up of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as we look into this narrative, today what we can find are two crucial anchor points that we can take hold of when we feel like we're hanging on by a thread. So we feel like we've got this rope in our hand and we're seeing it begin to unravel. And what I hope to leave you with are two anchor points that we can latch onto that will serve as stabilizers in the middle of that moment where we feel like we're hanging on by a thread. Now, years before the narrative we're going to look at, God had come to Abraham. And he had promised that he was going to make Abraham into a great nation. And he had told him that he was going to give him a promised land. And now, some 600 years later, the nation of Israel is positioned on the other side of the Jordan River. And across the Jordan River is this promised land that they knew God was going to give to them. And at that moment, Joshua, who is now leading the nation of Israel, sends two spies to scout out the land. Now, this was a brilliant move from Joshua. Absolutely brilliant leadership. And I don't have time to get into exactly why it was brilliant, but if you've never taken the time to read the stories of the Bible, I would highly encourage you to do that, because there's so much that you can learn. Even if you wouldn't consider yourself a Jesus follower, you would find so much rich truth that's applicable to everyday life. But this was brilliant leadership. So he sends these two spies, and he says, I want you to go over the Jordan River, and I want you to check out the area immediately on the other side of the Jordan, and I want you to scout out this first town that you're going to come to, this city called Jericho. Now, Jericho was a pretty massive city in those days, and it was pretty well fortified. But for you and I, we would approach that city of Jericho and we wouldn't think that much of it simply because of its size. It was about 9 acres. And for you, you may go, well, I put a couple of houses on 9 acres. Is that a city? I don't think so. But in this time, they put so many people into those 9 acres, and they were living on top of each other in all different ways so that they could cram thousands of people into this city structure of some 9 acres. But then they protected the people of that town, of Jericho. And they started with a retaining wall. The retaining wall was about 12 to 15 feet high. So if this is the Israelite army that's going to be coming, this wall is towering above them about twice as tall, 12 to 15 feet high. But this retaining wall was put in place to hold the dirt that fashioned this massive incline that led up to the actual city of Jericho at the top of the hill. And then not only was there a retaining wall, but then they came in and put a 6-foot wide, nearly 30-foot tall wall to serve as a defense against attacking armies. But that wasn't enough. Because not only was there a wall here, but they chose to put another wall at the top of the incline just before the city itself that was another 20 to 30 feet tall. So for the average person who's standing here on the ground, the top of the wall of that city was some 50 feet higher than their ground level was, which made this city nearly impenetrable. And not only that, but here in this city, inside the walls of this second gate, there was a spring that was naturally flowing fresh water. So they could lock the gates of this city, and there would not be any risk to the people of the city because there was fresh water coming continuously. And they had recently harvested all the crops, so they had grain and water and walls and a gate that was slammed shut. And they could resist any attackers. And it was at this point that Joshua sends his 2 spies to scope out Jericho. And as they got closer and started investigating, word got around that there were some spies in the land. And the king heard that there were spies who were present. And so the spies began to scurry, trying to figure out where they could go and how they could be safe. And they found the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And they snuck into her house, and she hid them on the roof of her house. But it wasn't long before the guards came, and they were pounding at the door of Rahab's house. And they were demanding that she deliver the spies to them. And so Rahab goes to the door and she lies to the leaders and says, I haven't seen those guys. They left here a long time ago. They went out the gate. I think the gate's closed, and they got out before the gates closed. And so the guards head off to try to find these spies. Now, if I was simply trying to write a story in which I was going to convince you to join a religion I was creating, this would not be the story I would write. I would write a pretty fairy tale of some kind. I wouldn't write a story that was messy, a story that had a prostitute and 2 spies who were trying to take over a land and a lady who's lying to the government authorities. That's not a pretty story, but it's a real-to-life story, which is why I love how clearly it's laid out. And for Rahab gets the weight of the moment. She knows that there is a nation that is marching on her city. She knows that her town has been scouted out, and she realizes that things don't look good. And so she goes up on the roof where these spies have hidden themselves underneath some of the materials there on the roof. And she has this conversation. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. As she begins this conversation, she says, listen, we've heard all about you, and we've heard what happened years ago in your past at the Red Sea, and how God showed up for you then. And we've heard more recently what just happened to the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. Our hearts melted, and our courage failed because we know the story. We've seen what's happened. And then she makes this profound statement. And she says, because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and in the earth below. She said, your God is not just some random idol. Your God is not just some random being, some power that a few of you chose to pray to. She said, no, from my perspective, your God is God. He's the God of heaven, and he's the God of earth. And it's right here in the entry part of this story that I think we can find our first of two anchor points. That in the middle of the situation where we feel like we are hanging on by a thread, that we have to grab the anchor of recognizing God at work. Recognizing God at work in and around us. You see, for most of us, it's really easy to be overwhelmed when we hit that moment where we feel like we are at the end of the rope and we're dangling by a thread in that moment. It's easy to be overwhelmed, and it's easy to believe this is the worst circumstance I have ever faced in my life. It doesn't matter what has happened to us, it doesn't matter what has happened to other people, but in that moment, it's overwhelming. And so we believe this is the worst thing I've ever endured, whether it is or not. But in that moment for Rahab, she was able to pull back, realizing that her life and her family were at risk. And she was able to say, I believe that God has worked with you people before, which means I have every expectation he's going to work with you people again, the Israelites, this nation of Israel. But what does that look like for us? Because in the middle of our most difficult situations, what if we pull back and we would acknowledge, you know what? I've seen God show up before. And in the middle of the mess that whatever this is that I'm entrenched in right now, because I've seen him before, I have the confidence that I'll see him again. That God can work in the messiest of situations, and even there, do something amazing. Maybe you've got a paper notebook, or maybe you keep those kind of things on your phone. But what if we started keeping track of the big moments where we felt completely overwhelmed? What if you went back and filled in some of those blanks as you began to think back through your story of times that you saw God show up in your circumstance? And you began to note, here's the situation, and I thought it was the end of this. And then I saw God. And then this happened. And then I saw God work it out like this. And I never would have expected, but I saw God. And I'm still waiting, but I believe I'll see him again. What if we took those kind of notes? Where have I seen God in my past, and in my family, and in my circumstances, and in my surroundings? Where have I seen God before that gives me the confidence that I will see God show up again? Now, arguably, at times, we are so overwhelmed that it's almost impossible to think back to those scenarios. And it's in those moments that I would challenge you to borrow the faith of someone else who has walked through the situation you're walking through, someone who can say, I know how you hurt, but I've come out on the other side. And yeah, the pain isn't completely gone, but I still have hope. I still have confidence. I still believe that God can work. But at the same time today, I recognize that for some of us who say, recognize God at work, I'm not certain God is at work. And in fact, I'm kind of skeptical of the whole concept of God at work. And I understand that. And what's really neat about this narrative is that for Rahab, she wasn't a God person either. But in the moment where she found herself hanging on by a thread, she said, you know what? I may not be a God person, but I can recognize when something bigger than me is at play. And I see that in this nation of Israel. So she says to the men on the roof, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family. By the God that you embrace, swear by that God that you're going to show kindness to my family because I've shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother and my brothers and my sister, all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. I want you to swear by the God that you claim that you're going to take care of me and everybody I love. To which the men replied, our lives for your life, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we're doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So they're here on the roof. She could give them away in a moment. And they pledge to her that they will keep her safe. But then they say this really amazing statement. We will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us this land. Now, it's possible that you grew up in church and you've heard this story a time or two. And so you may know already how the story plays out. But for these guys, they're cowering on the roof beneath some of the materials that are up there in hopes that this woman doesn't betray them and they end up dead. And in the middle of that moment, they're able to say, we don't know how and we don't know what it'll look like, but we're really confident that God is going to deliver this land into our hands. They had this amazing confidence in God. So she lets them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of that city wall, that external wall. Between the walls, the more impoverished you were, the more likely it was that you lived down in this area closer to the wall. And so Rahab the harlot is living adjacent to, or maybe her house backs up against. Somehow she's able to leverage this wall, and there's a window in the wall that she lets these men down using this rope. Now the men had said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord to the window through which you let us down. And unless you have brought your father and your mother and your brothers and all your family into your house. So they say to her, this cord that you've just let us down from, you leave this in the window. And you get all of your family into your house, your apartment. And then whoever's there will be safe. That's the only way that we're obligated to follow through on our promise. Agreed, she replied. Let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she, I love this, she tied the scarlet cord in the window. Now, if she believed that her nation was about to be obliterated, if she believed that these men would keep their promise and that she and her family would be safe if that scarlet cord hung in the window, how many knots do you think she put into that tie to ensure that it stayed in the window? She was diligent to make sure that cord was not going to slip loose. She didn't just put it in the window and close the sash. She tied that thing in place so that there was no way that there could be any mistake that that scarlet cord was hanging out the window so that her family could be delivered. Now, the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in and no one came out. Because this nation was fearful of the nation of Israel who was sweeping up on them, they shut the city and they prepared for a siege. And you can imagine, day after day, the anticipation that's building in this city as they're fearfully peering out and watching to see if there's any movement in the troops. And then the Lord says to Joshua, the leader of this nation of Israel, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men. To which Joshua replied, really? You haven't delivered anything. There is this heavily fortified city, and they've just locked the doors. What's the battle plan? What's the strategy? How are we going to take this city down? And God explains. He said, I want you to march around the city once with all the armed men. And I want you to do this for 6 days. And have 7 priests carry the trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. So here's the picture. There's the forward guard, and then there's the priests with their trumpets. Then there's the Ark of the Covenant, represented God's presence with the nation of Israel. And then there's the rear guard. And God says, I want you to go out, and I want you to parade around the city of Jericho. Don't attack, don't threaten, don't do anything. Simply parade around the city. Which you can imagine if Joshua is trying to explain this to these mighty men, these men who are ready to attack, who believe they can take the city. And then they're told, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to parade around the city. It'll be great. How exciting was that? God continues, and he says, on the 7th day, I want you to march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing their trumpets. So now we've got a parade with a band. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. And then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will run straight up, everyone straight in. So this is the plan that they begin to execute. And they begin to march around the city 1 time for day 1. The Israelites marched. The people of Jericho watched. What do you think Rahab did? She tightened the cord in the window. And the next day, the nation of Israel comes back. And the people prepare, and they look out, and they're nervous, and they're scared. And the Israelites march around again. And Rahab secures that cord just 1 more time. She warns her family, get away from the window. Stay. Don't mess with that cord. And again, and again, and again, and again. And then on the 7th day, 7 times around the city. And it's there that we find our second anchor point when we feel like we're hanging on by a thread. Not only do we recognize God at work, but we have to repeat a daily faith step. A daily faith step. Now, for many of us, we know the benefit of creating a new routine or a new habit, and certainly as times change around us, as they have recently, it's important to create new habits and new routines that begin to adapt and adjust for the reality that we live in. But when we say create a daily faith step, we're not talking there of the faith of a creed or a denomination. And we're not talking about the faith that comes from some momentous decision, although there are mile markers in our spiritual journey. Here we're talking about a daily faith, because faith is a daily determination. And with our elementary kids in Upstreet, we teach them that it's a daily determination that I can trust God no matter what. But for us, we'll phrase it this way. Faith is a daily determination. It's a confidence that God is who he says he is, and he will do what he promises to do. Now that seems relatively easy to have that daily determination. It's relatively easy until we can't see how our circumstance is going to work out. We've thought it through every which way, and we can't figure it out, and we don't know how God's going to intervene or how he's going to be a part of it, and we can't figure out a plan. And so we look at that, and all of a sudden, our faith begins to waver. It's at those moments where we're at our wits' end, And when we experience disappointment, and we're like, wait, God, I thought you were going to work it out, and I wasn't going to feel this way, and I wasn't going to experience this. That's when we realize that our faith isn't as strong as we thought it was. And often it's not as strong as we thought it was because our faith has atrophied. It's weak. It's pained because we have not exercised it along the way. Think just practically. The things that you exercise, the things that you practice, if you were only to exercise once a month, how strong would you be in that muscle group? If you were to practice something once a month, how good would you be at that thing? Maybe a couple times a quarter. Are you getting any better? But what about if you practice every day? What if you invest that time and you exercise day after day after day after day? What happens to that muscle group? How strong does it become then? How effective can it be? So that begs the question, how do we exercise our faith? How does our faith grow? How do we grow our faith? If it's something that needs to be exercised and stretched and prepared for those moments where we're at the end of our rope, how do we exercise our faith? Well, there's a few different ways, and some of these may be familiar to you, but we phrase them like this. We say that there's practical teaching is a way that we begin to exercise our faith, which is why last week, if you were with us, we said pick a service and stick with it. Pick a service time and stick with it. Choose when you're going to connect in person, online. Choose that service time and stick with it, because it's when we're exposed to practical teaching from the Bible that we begin to go, wait a second. I see what God says, but I also see what my life looks like. And what if I brought those into alignment? And it causes us to exercise our faith. Practical teaching, then providential relationships. There are moments where we are surrounded by other people who stretch our faith because we're called to love people who are different than us. And God uniquely surrounds us with people. Sometimes as we put ourselves in those places to be surrounded, which is why we told you last week, pick a small group and commit to it. If you're in a group, commit to that group of people. If you're not yet in a group, this weekend we have open registration for new groups, and you can express your interest by going to lakeoconeechurch.org/groups, plural, and you can begin to explore some of the group options, and we'll send some information to you. But as we surround ourselves with people in a small group, it's a small group of people that comes together to grow and to study God's word and to pray together. But those will be people who don't think like you do in every area of life. And all of a sudden, your faith gets stretched as you're learning to love people who aren't like you. And in fact, people you might not choose to like. But we have the opportunity to love them the way our Heavenly Father has loved us. So, providential relationships are a way that we exercise that faith muscle. But there's another way that we exercise that faith muscle that we describe as private disciplines. And private disciplines are those things that nobody sees, but God says that He rewards. The things that are between us and God and no one else knows about, and yet God honors those things as they play out in our lives. Those are the things where we decide, hey, God says give a portion of everything that I'm earning and give it away, be generous with it. And so I'm going to do that, and I don't know why or how that honors God, but I'm going to trust Him. I'm going to exercise my faith muscle, and I'm going to make that a routine in my life. Or maybe I'm going to come to God with the burdens that are on my mind and on my heart, and I'm not really good at being poetic or sounding like a preacher, but I'm just going to tell God, God, this is how I feel. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I'm thinking. And God says, bring those things to me and leave them with me and let me worry about them. So God, I don't understand how all that works, but I'm going to practice that discipline because it's something that you ask of me. And maybe for others of us, it's sitting down and saying, God, I've told you what I'm thinking, but I want to hear what you're thinking. So I want to open the Bible and I want to begin to read how you think and how you see so that I can align my life with that. And that may sound super foreign and really, really difficult, but there's some really simple ways that we can take a step that becomes a private daily discipline. One of the most effective things I've ever done is I've taken the book of Proverbs. There's 31 chapters, and I've read one proverb a day. But as I read that proverb, I look for one overriding theme. Proverbs is written by Solomon, one of the wisest leaders that ever lived. And as he's writing, he writes about all different facets of life. So I read through the entire book of Proverbs over the course of a month, looking at what does God say about the way I use my words. And then I'll read it again the next month. What does God say about the way that I use my money? And what are some money principles that God sees? And what does that look like? And there's so many different aspects that you could read through that. Maybe for others, there's a devotional book that you go to and you spend a little time learning about God and aligning your life with Him every single day. Maybe for you, you do everything on your phone. So you could go to the YouVersion Bible app and you can find a plan that helps you read through the entire Bible in a year. You can find a plan that just addresses a topic and you can read for 5 days about that topic. Just little bits, little snippets each day for the course of a week. But that's a way that we exercise our faith through these private disciplines. And here's the cool thing, that just like the Israelites spent that time marching around the wall daily, just like Rahab daily is adjusting that cord and believing and hoping, some 1,400 years later, we find out that the story of Rahab was not just a story for the Israelites and not just a story for the people of Jericho, but it was, in fact, instruction for you and me as well. Because the writer of Hebrews, who is writing to these newly launched churches after Jesus has lived and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, writes this: by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. And by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And the writer goes on to say, and without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. That daily practice of demonstrating faith was important for the Israelites. It was important for Rahab, and it's important for you and I as well. Because as Jesus followers, faith is an ongoing daily journey as we align our lives, our values, and our approach with His. And that's why, when we find ourselves hanging on by a thread, that finding 2 anchor points to hang on to, the solid anchor points of recognizing God at work and repeating a daily faith step, can be so incredibly pivotal. And if you've ever wondered if God allows that kind of faith to change the trajectory of a messy situation, a goofed up life, then let me share the rest of the story of Rahab with you. Because not only was Rahab and her family spared as the walls fell, but Rahab went on to become the mother of Boaz, who married Ruth and became the great-grandfather of King David. And when Matthew wrote his documentary of Jesus' life, his gospel, he included Rahab in the family tree of Jesus. When it was literally all falling down around Rahab, she chose to grab on to a daily faith. So when it's all falling down around you and I, let's choose to follow her example and see what God does with our story as well.